We read in this week's portion, Shelach, where the Jews come up with this idea. They're about to go into Israel, into the promised land, Canaan. We leave Egypt. We witness 10 plagues. Egypt is decimated, the country. We're pursued by the Egyptian armies to the Red Sea. We're caught between the Red Sea and the Egyptian army. God splits the sea for us, which is a level of miracle, nothing comparable to that miracle. We pass through the sea closes on the Egyptians, they were all destroyed. The armies are destroyed by the closing of the sea. And then we continue to Sinai. On the way, experience more miracles. We came to a bitter oasis. The water has turned sweet for us. We're confronted. We have no water. Moshe is told to strike the rock. There's enough water for all the millions of people there. Then we're attacked by the Amalekites. There's a battle. We defeat them. We finally come to Sinai. God brings heaven to earth. He openly speaks to us. The 10 Commandments, gives us the Torah. We're engulfed with the clouds of glory. We have the man. We have the water. And then Moshe sends to bring down the tablets. The Jews get off track, the golden calf. Moshe descends, breaks the tablets. Finally, we're reinstated, a second set of tablets. Okay? A Mishkan is built. We go further. Now we're ready to go into Israel. And also there are various mishaps on the way, ready to go in. All of a sudden now, a newfangled idea comes to their mind. Before we go in, we want to send scouts to scout out the land to see what it's all about. I mean, God has proven himself at a level that he's credible and he's there for us at every level. And there's nothing beyond his ability to provide anything which he's proven he has. And the Jews say, we want to first send scouts. We want to see, how do we enter into the land? How do we conquer this land? And God says, I'm leading the group. It's a land which flows with milk and honey. What do you need scouts? What do you have to send anyone? God is taking you by the hand and bring you in to conquer that land. But yet they said, we need scouts. What happened? And God says to Moshe, I've said what it is, but if you want to allow them to send spies or scouts, whatever way you want to term it, I allow you to do this. And he sent 12 spies. But he says, before you send them, I'm the one to choose who is qualified to be the scout, to be the spy. And each one who was chosen was a prince, the prince of each one of the tribes. 12 princes go. This is the elite. This is the highest echelon of Jew, are chosen to go to scout out the land. And they come back. And what did they see when they went to Canaan? Wherever they turn, they see people burying their dead, as if there was a plague. And who do they see who's unaffected by the plague? Giants. The common folk are all affected by this plague because everybody's burying their dead. And the giants are intact, immune to this. In addition, they see the fruits of the land. They're of abnormal size, abnormal. And they bring back the fruits and they come back with these reports. 10 of the spies say, it's a land which devours its inhabitants. God is taking us into a death trap, a death trap. 2 of the spies, Kalev and Yeshua, Kalev representing the tribe of Judah, and Yeshua representing the tribe of Ephraim, say no. It's exactly what God says. It's a good land. We will conquer, we will destroy them. We will drive them out of the land. They both came back. They saw the same thing. One's interpretation is ominous, disastrous, tragedy, catastrophic beyond one's imagination. 2 of the 12 say no. It's the ultimate, like they just saw paradise. How could 2 groups of people see it so differently? 10 see it as a death trap, and the 2 don't see it as that. And of course, the Jews, they favored the majority, the 10, not the 2. And they believe God is taking them into Canaan to destroy them, because evidently it's not survivable, as they reported. What does God do? Then the 10 spies immediately, after the Jews, they go and they encourage them to assume their position, because Kalev and Yeshua, Kalev did not remain silent. And he tried to explain to the people that these people, the 10, are not seeing it right. And they're slandering the land, and they're slandering God. And the spies, when they realized it, they went and they worked the crowd to convince them that their position, their interpretation is more correct. And the 2 are off, totally off. And they embraced the position of the 10. God says, because you embraced the position of the 10, although you're supposed to go into the land, you people will not go into the land. You will die over a 40-year period, and the new generation will go into the land. And what happened to the spies? Immediately, they were struck down by God, and they died the most grotesque type of death, which clearly was the hand of God. And the Jews said immediately, we sinned. They prayed to be forgiven. God said it's too late, which we're going to explain exactly why it was too late. After you crossed that line, it was a very serious line you crossed. Based on your background, there's no going back. It's unforgivable. You will die. Anybody between the age of 20 and 60 will perish over the 40-year period. The new generation will go in, which is what happened. Now, why did God choose only the princes? You know, most people, when they report, when they see something, unless you're trained to see something accurately, you don't report it and process it accurately. You know, you see something, it has, this report is a semblance of what you saw. And very often, you intermingle with it some of your own preconceived ideas, and you say you saw things which aren't even reality. Or you omit things because somehow you didn't even notice them. Because to you at the time, they weren't important, so it didn't even register with the person who saw it. But a person is a person of status. He sees it all. He doesn't miss a detail. The Nesiim, the princes, were people of status, great distinction. They're the highest echelon of Jews. So when they reported back facts, they were accurate. Kalev and Yeshua and the 10 others, the facts were identical. What the disagreement was, how do I interpret those facts? Nobody's disagreeing. People died. There were giants. Fruits were of abnormal size. Everything was accurate. It's a land that flows with milk and honey. No disagreement. But the question is, how do I interpret that? The 10 that interpreted people dying, it's a death trap. You cannot survive there unless you're of an abnormal dimension, such as a giant. We're not giants. Kalev and Yeshua said, you don't understand. We went for an objective to spy out the land. If people wouldn't have been immersed in their grief, burying their dead, we would have been noticed. And we couldn't scout out the land properly because we would have been concerned they'll identify us, they'll detect us. But people will be so immersed in their pain and their sorrow and their grief we're going to go unnoticed. It's unbelievable what kind of miracle God performed on our behalf. So Kalev and Yeshua see it. This is the ultimate gift of God. Look what God did for us. And the others see it. It's catastrophic. It's a death trap. God is out to destroy us. Now the question is, why did Kalev and Yeshua see it in the most positive context and the other saw it in the most negative? That they saw it as a death trap. And therefore they tried to discourage in the worst way the people not to enter the land. And they bought their interpretation. And therefore they were condemned to die over a 40-year period. Which vantage point was each group coming from? But the Sephardim makes a point. God had to choose them. The caliber of the spies, because an ordinary person, if they would have left out some of the facts and they're arguing on the facts when the truth comes to light, the question is what happened? What were the facts? Here, there's no disagreement of facts. They're all agreeing what they saw was accurate. It's only a question how to interpret those facts. Was it positive or was it negative? Is this a death trap or this is the ultimate? Hashem is there to protect us and he wants us to get the accurate reading, and that's why he had brought all this tragedy on the people of Canaan. At the beginning of Bamidbar, which is this Sefer, this Chumash, the Sepharno writes that because of this sin of the Meraglim, of the spies, we were delayed for 40 years in the desert. When we came into Canaan, there was a commandment that you must annihilate the 7 tribes of Canaan, because they represent evil, and that evil has to be expunged from the land, and all the people have to be killed. They have to be destroyed. Lo sechai kol neshama. No living person could be left, could remain. That be annihilated. So he writes that if the Jews would have gone in immediately, because they didn't perpetrate those evils for an additional 40 years, they would have just had to leave the land. They wouldn't have been annihilated. But because the Jews were waylaid in the desert for 40 years, and they continued to sin for an additional 40 years, they reached that quotient of evil, and therefore they were at a point of no return. They had to be destroyed. So the reason why they were destroyed was because the Jews were delayed for 40 years. They were waylaid in the desert, so they were able to continue, and it became exaggerated, their behavior, and therefore they had to be destroyed. There's an interesting midrash. Factually, that we didn't go in immediately, evidently we weren't ready. You'd think after Sinai, after witnessing all the miracles, we'd come to an understanding of reality and a level of internalization that all issues of question, of trust would be in place. But evidently it wasn't. So that itself was an indication we're not ready to go into the Holy Land, to function as that spiritual people. Because after the 10 plagues, after the splitting of the sea, after witnessing a Sinai, and God openly communicating with you, if you could fall to this level and believe that God's intention is to destroy you, evidently you people are not worthy. You don't have the capacity to perform at a level that's expected, therefore you people will perish. This was the litmus test. We'll discuss this in a moment. Because otherwise, it was something would have been an impossibility for you even to consider and suspect God, after all God had done for you, that he's out to destroy you. Okay? We had read about in the last week how Miriam had spoken critically of Moshe. And she became a leper. What did she say? We had read last week that Moshe says to Hashem, the Jewish people, they're a contentious people. And it's too difficult for me to handle them. And he says, I want you should designate others to share a burden with me. So he says, take 70 elders that you choose, and I will pass your spirit onto them, and they will assist you in leading the people. So the Torah tells us there were two people of the 70. One's name was Eldad, the other person's name was Medad, and they were prophesying in the camp. They were prophesying publicly, so they became prophets. They all became prophets at the special level because God passed the spirit of Moshe onto them, and they assumed a new level of prophecy. So Moshe's wife, Tzipporah, when she heard these two people prophesying, she said, woe to the wives of these two people, because now they're going to have to experience what I experienced. Because after Sinai, when Moshe assumed that special level of prophecy, he separated from me. We're not involved as husband and wife any longer. Now, woe to their wives also, they're going to have to separate from their husbands. Until then, Miriam was not aware that Moshe no longer engaged with his wife. So Miriam shares this with her brother Aaron and says, why did Moshe do this? We ourselves were also prophets. We continue to live within the context of conjugal obligations, relationship. Why did Moshe not? Why did he cease the conjugal relationship with his wife? Why? That's all she shares. And Miriam loved her brother. She put her life in jeopardy for her brother when he was put into the Nile, and so on and so forth. But she spoke critically of him. All of a sudden, God summons Moshe with Moshe and Aaron to go into the communion tent, and soon after that, she becomes a leper. She becomes a leper. And Hashem says to her, how do you speak about Moshe Avdi, Moshe, my servant? And then Torah says, Moshe was the most humble person who ever walked the face of the earth. How do you speak about Moshe Avdi? If he would have been just Moshe, not even my servant, how do you speak critically of him? And if he's my servant, not Moshe, if he's my servant, how do you speak critically of him? And if it's compounded, he's Moshe and my servant, definitely how do you speak critically of him? Meaning, if he's my servant, doesn't that speak volumes that his decision is not something wrong? So evidently, there's a difference between him and you people. What's the difference? Moshe, I openly communicate with him. You people, when you prophesize, it's in a sleep state, not an awake state. Moshe prophesies in the awake state. If a person engages with his wife, there's a level of contamination, and therefore the person is not in a position to receive that communication. Moshe being at an advanced level, after Sinai, God says, you will remain with me. During Sinai, all men and women, they had to separate. After Sinai, God says, let all of them return to their tents, to their wives. You remain with me. God said to Moshe, you remain with me. Because you're at that special level. If you ever engage with your wife, you're contaminated. And since you have to be on 24/7 call continuously, you always have to be in a position to be worthy or qualified to receive that communication. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu separated. So he says to Miriam, how did you read it so wrong? Isn't it obvious that Moshe is different than you people? Even if you don't understand why, but evidently he's different, because if he's still my servant and I still treat him as my dedicated service, evidently he did nothing wrong. So how do you speak critically of him? So that should have immediately spoken volumes that there's no basis for criticism here. That was Miriam's mistake. Miriam's mistake was she saw it wrongly, but she believed what she saw was a basis for criticism. And it may have been constructive criticism in her own mind. But since it wasn't justified, therefore there's a claim against her. Now the spies, they're going to Canaan. God factually said it's a land that flows with milk and honey. It's a land that's good. You will thrive there. There can be no mishaps there. So if that is a reality, come back and say, no, we have questions. What we saw was a death trap. Don't you understand? Based on that, if you would have drawn the lesson from Miriam correctly, you would have said that interpretation is not, it doesn't even hold water. It's not even to be considered. I understand you saw it differently, but Miriam also saw it differently until she was enlightened. When you pointed out the facts, if he's Moshe Avdi, it is impossible he's doing anything wrong, because otherwise God wouldn't have had that level of relationship with him. So if God himself says it's a land that flows with milk and honey, it's a land which is filled only with good, how do you come out with reports that it's a death trap? Well, that's the way we understood it. But it's clear your reading is wrong. Because if God said differently, you should have seen it as Kalev and Yeshua had seen it. So why didn't you? And because you didn't, therefore there's a claim, and therefore you deserve to be destroyed. And therefore the Jewish people deserved not to go into the land, and that whole generation is going to perish over a 40-year period for that same reason. So you can have two things factually identical, but how do you read that? It's a whole different reading. The interpretation. Well, what is the interpretation based upon? Trust. If you have trust, the alternative is not even accepted. It's not even to be considered for a moment. It's a death trap. How could it be a death trap? God took us out of Egypt. He split the sea. He took us to Sinai. He gave us his Torah. We're engulfed with the clouds of glory. We have Man, and we have the wellspring of Miriam continuously. After all that, God's going to destroy us. It's unacceptable. It's incomprehensible. It's foolishness. If you have trust, it's foolishness. If you trust God. If you don't trust him, and you think he has some trick up his sleeve, that this is all only to mislead us and ultimately will destroy us. So you say, no, this all doesn't make sense. It depends where you're coming from. I'm going to explain it right now. Later, there's a Sephardo that says, they said, God wants to destroy us. God hates us. In what context does God show that he hates them? And why should he hate them? The Jews in Egypt were idolaters. Initially, the whole thing didn't make any sense. We ourselves are pagans, idolaters as the Egyptians. And God takes us out of Egypt and he destroys the Egyptians. And he performs miracles which are unheard of. And he takes us through a sea, which is 250 miracles took place. This doesn't make sense. Why is he treating us royally with kid gloves when we're not deserving of that level of treatment, of that level of relationship? So there was always a suspectful eye among the core of the Jewish people. If somebody, all of a sudden, you meet him, and also he treats you so exceptionally well with kid gloves and just lavishes you with everything under the sun, any conceivable kindness, you say, you know something? This doesn't make sense. But you know something? As long as it's going well, I'm okay with it. But all of a sudden, when you hear something which somehow confirms something that at a certain level you suspected, this only confirms now it all makes sense. Because the whole thing didn't make sense from the very beginning. That's where the Jews were coming from. Because we were idolaters, they couldn't believe, since we failed so seriously, how does God, and then we did the Egel after the giving of Torah at Sinai. It's unforgivable. Well, Moshe told us, God said, we are forgiven. You know something? It doesn't really resonate with us, or we can't embrace that. You know, it's like a person has a very good friend for years, and all of a sudden that person does an act of betrayal, which is unheard of. And the person who was victimized as a result of this betrayal says to his friend, I forgive you. Make believe it never happened. Humanly, it's almost an impossibility. You can maintain some semblance of a relationship, but to reinstate it to the point where it was initially, after the level of betrayal, it's impossible. So what does the person say? And also, but he's treating him like it never happened. The man is waiting for the moment to let down my God, then he's going to take revenge. And he's going to avenge the betrayal. That's what's in the back of the mind of the person when he sees how he's treated as if the betrayal never took place. We betrayed God. It was bad enough he took us out. We were idolaters. We believed we weren't worthy. But after he puts us on a pedestal and we get involved with idolatry, with the golden calf, and God says, I still forgive you. And he gives us a second set of tablets, a reinstatement. We're very suspect. And we're going. And because we were suspect, we said, you know something? We want to send spies. We want to know for ourselves factually. We want to clear the air, make sure it's as we hoped it is. They come back with these ominous reports, which to them, because of where they were coming from, that only confirms our suspicions to be true. Because they were coming from a vantage point, they had difficulty believing that they could be forgiven because of the idolatry and to what degree they failed. Now this only confirms that was the incentive. That what precipitated the sending of the spies. Yeshua and Kalev, they believed that God fully forgave them. And we are truly his chosen nation. And we are truly his favored son. Plus, much more than that. Therefore, when they saw people dying, and whatever they saw there, the other interpretation wasn't even a consideration whatsoever. Impossible. To say that that's what God is doing, it's like a person's raised by a father, and the father raises the child with a level of love and givingness and opportunity. And somebody goes to the child and says, you know, your father is really convincing you at a certain thing, but ultimately he will destroy you. They say to the person, what are you talking about? There must be something wrong with you. There's no basis for it. Why should he want to do that? And that's exactly, if God showed us enough that we were reinstated and the love is there beyond anyone's imagination, what love is for the Jewish people, and we are the basis for existence, how do you come up with this concocted, convoluted nonsense, this warped, distorted interpretation of reality? And that's what God said to them. And you know why it wasn't forgivable? Because the law is, which we discussed many times, Chil Hashem, a public desecration of God's name, is unforgivable. Even death, you can only forgive him when you die. So therefore, the decree had to be death. They had to die over this period of time. You could pray, you could do tshuva from today forever. Because of the degree of desecration of God's name, public desecration, you cannot be forgiven. Therefore, that generation had to pass away. But what was the failing of the spies? The spies were most culpable. You had who did learn from. Miriam made the mistake. Miriam was so-called the role model. She read it based on her comparing herself to Moshe. The mistake was it didn't have to be read that way. She should have understood. The takeaway should have been, if God maintains and retains his relationship with Moshe, evidently Moshe did nothing wrong. So how do you equate yourself to Moshe? They should have learned. And that's what it juxtaposes the story of Miriam to the story of the spies. These evil people, they should have learned their lesson, and they did not. And because they did not, the Jewish people were taken down. And they were put on hold for 40 years until this generation passed away and the new generation went into Canaan for that reason. Now, there's a question which is asked. Miriam, when she was a leper, they were traveling, and God says, everything's put on hold now. For Miriam to overcome her level of leprosy, it's a 7-day process. So God says, I will wait for the 7-day period. The clouds of glory will wait. And the 600,000 men above the age of 20, meaning the whole camp of Israel is going to wait until Miriam recovers and is reinstated into the camp. She overcomes a contamination. Why? Because when God rewards, it's measure for measure. Just as when Moshe Rabbeinu was put into the Nile, in the bulrushes, in that little box by his mother, it says, Miriam, his sister, waited at a distance to see what was going to happen to him. As she waited, God says, we will wait. Out of respect, she deserves that we should wait. I will wait, the clouds of glory will wait, and the Jewish people wait. We're not continuing to travel. There's no such thing as she's going to catch up. There's no catch up. So the question is asked, you know what it means, a woman like Miriam becoming a leper? Because she spoke negatively about her brother. It's an embarrassment. You know something? Miriam should have said, God, don't do me any favors. Let's just sweep it under the carpet. Let them go, and I'll catch up. God says, no, because you waited for your brother to see what was going to happen to him, whether he would drown or you'd be able to intervene and save him. Therefore, I owe it to you, and we're going to wait. So everybody should know that you spoke Lashon Hara about your brother. If it would be one of us who said, no, thank you. What kind of glory is this? This is embarrassment. But evidently, if God did it, this is the ultimate in what? In reward. What is the reward? There's a positive commandment in the Torah. And when you say this every day, you fulfill a positive commandment. Remember what Hashem had done to Miriam on the way when you left Egypt. To remember how serious speaking ill of another person, where it's not for constructive value, that is a culpability. It's a positive commandment. So what is Miriam? Miriam is the role model, is the example for all time. Every Jew to understand what is the seriousness of speaking something of critical nature where it's not for constructive value. And Miriam understood that. That she's put in the forefront, even though it's an embarrassment. She failed. And she's being reprimanded by God, be punished by God. It doesn't make a difference. But if the lesson to be drawn will benefit the Jewish people, I'm there. I'm there for I'm there for God, I'm there for the Jewish people, regardless of the cost factor. That's Miriam. So therefore, that is the ultimate, that is the reward. The reward is something for all eternity. Now, why was that such a special lesson? It's a special lesson. But you know why it was such a special lesson? Because if the spies would have learned the lesson well, this whole story of the spies would have never happened. So there's a side of that lesson, if it would have been implemented immediately, the Jews would have rejected the interpretation of the spies. The spies themselves would have seen it differently. Although we see it seeming the way we see it, evidently it can't be true. Because if it would be true, that means God is doing something which is unconscionable to us. That's an impossibility. But they didn't draw it that way. They didn't learn the lesson well. And because they didn't learn the lesson well, they succumbed to their own failings and they took themselves and the Jewish people down. And we waylaid for 40 years that whole generation had to perish. Ramchal writes in the Das Tfunos, why did God create evil? God created evil that we should not do evil. That since a person has to have choice, and choice is alternatives, so God had to choose the alternative of good, because that creates the context of choice, that when we make a choice, we choose not to do evil. That's the value of evil, is not to do evil, because that creates the context of choice. So over here, Miriam, it was important for us, it should become public knowledge that at least now the Meraglim, the spies, they have a choice. Do you read it right or do you read it wrong? They read it wrong, but why did they read it wrong? Because they were evil. Because they did not trust God and they thought God was out and strategized in the most Machiavellian way to bring him to the cliff and throw them off the cliff. After all the miracles that he performed, all the miracles was to delude him and deceive them and mislead them to believe one thing and he was going to destroy them. That's how convoluted their belief was, and that's how they suspected and did not trust God to that degree. Give you an example. An anti-Semite. Person is truly an anti-Semite. You could prove yourself endless times over. The anti-Semite is an undercurrent within his mind, his emotion. Someday it will be proven what the Jew is. What's the basis? The Jews have always contributed to society. They were always an asset. But what about that Jew? And we're always painted with the same brush, whether it's a handful or not a handful. Yesterday, I just heard a little bit of a podcast. He was the past ambassador of Israel to the United Nations. He said something unbelievable. He met when he became the ambassador. Usually, you become ambassador, usually you meet with 10 ambassadors of other countries. So he met with the ambassador of Burundi. And until 10 years before 2006, there were atrocities there. And in that period of time, 300,000 people died in all this, whatever, this chaos that went on there. And once they put their foot down, there's peace there. Things are peaceful. So this person says to this other ambassador, he says, how many people do you think died in the 20th century till present day in Israel? How many people were killed due to all the conflicts? He says, I'm not getting involved in justified, not just, are we occupied, not, but how many people died from the beginning of the 20th century till now, till 2021? You know what he says to him? But this was in 2006. He says, 2 million or 3 million people died, were killed. See, the ambassador says to the ambassador of Burundi, he says, 20,000 people from 2000, from the beginning of the year 1900 until 2006, 20,000 people, Arabs and Jews together died. Wars, whatever happened, that's what died as a result of the conflicts. Couldn't believe it. Here, within a few years, 300,000 people were killed. In Israel, with all the wars and everything, 20,000 Arabs and Jews died within a period of over 106 years. He says, I can't believe it. He says, so why is the world saying such a terrible thing about you Jews? You understand what's going on over here? Because because of the anti-Semitism is exaggerated, magnified beyond your imagination. Because when you see somebody in the negative, you won't give them the benefit of the doubt. You won't do the investigation. And even if you find the fact can be accurate. It can be, it must be worse than that, and whatever else. Because that's the way the world processes our existence. You know, you have a thin strip of land, which is the size of the state of New Jersey, and the whole world wants to devour us. Does that make sense? The whole world, we're the cause of all the turmoil in the world. 16 million people in the world, and the world can't live with us. Because the Jew there's the protocols of Zion. There's this ominous, behind the scenes, evil with taking over the world. There's a whole plot going on over here. You understand? It's like almost like a sick mind. But that's the reality of the non-Jew versus the Jew. This is Esav Sonei Yaakov. Esav hates Yaakov, and until the coming Mashiach, this anti-Semitism will be in place, exaggerated, intensified continuously. And it always rears its head. And now we're getting a little taste of it now. We thought we're secure. It's behind us. It's never behind us. And God is giving us reminders that peace and tranquility is Him. It has nothing with us. It has to do with our behavior. And we don't understand why, when, why, certain times yes, certain times not. We don't know. You know, Yosef was the viceroy of Egypt. And Pharaoh has a dream, two dreams, which he tells him it's one dream, interprets it, and he tells him what's going to happen. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. The famine is going to be so bad, so extreme, that people will forget about that there was ever years of plenty. And the years of plenty will be at a level never existed in the world. And he gave him a solution, how to deal with it, and so on and so forth. He was appointed to be the viceroy. He oversaw the distribution of the food. He collected the wealth of the world to Egypt. And he saved the country. He saved all humanity, Yosef, due to his overseeing the distribution process. And Egypt became the wealthiest civilization in the world at the time. All the wealth of the world came to Egypt. Okay? All of a sudden, 2 years into the famine, who comes to Egypt? Yosef's brothers. And finally, they unite, he reveals that he's Yosef, their brother, who he sold him to slavery. And word gets back to Pharaoh, himself and to his household. And it says, Pharaoh they were very happy that Yosef was reunited with his family. So the question is, why were they so happy? You think they were so appreciative for Yosef that what? Yosef now finally, he's back together with his family. What were they so happy about? Why were they so excited? So the Sephara over there says something very interesting. He says, because now that Yosef's family is coming to Egypt, he's going to give us his all. Until now, he hasn't given us his all yet. But now that his family's here, and now it's on a personal level, he will give us even more than he's been giving us. Could he do more? If not for Yosef, the land would have perished. They would all have died. You're the wealthiest civilization in existence. You're the most secure, the most powerful, only because of Yosef. But now that his family's here, now he's really he's going to give us all he has. His full ability. Because it's for his family. What are you talking about? But Yosef is not a pagan like us. He's a Hebrew. He's not one of us. We'll never trust these Jews. Unless they have a vested interest in themselves, they cannot be trusted. Could you imagine? Well, to what degree, how off this is? I mean, he gives you his right hand, his left hand. What else do you want him to give you? He's dedicated his life to you. What else do you want? He hasn't done enough. Evidently, he can do more. Because now that his family, he's going to do more. The Jews themselves, here. I mean, how could you mistrust God to such a degree? And because you did, it's unforgivable. You should have read it differently. So Miriam had to experience this embarrassment to give the Jewish people and the spies an opportunity to read it right. Here you have a model of somebody who is special and saw it wrong. Learn from that model. And if you learn from the model, not only do you save yourselves, you save the whole Jewish people. And you avoid a public desecration of God's name. But as it says, these evil people, they saw what happened and they did not make the takeaway. They did not draw that constructive lesson that they should have drawn. And therefore it was disastrous. And therefore it was unforgivable. It's known that when you build a skyscraper, as high as the building is, that's how deep the foundation has to be. The higher the building, the deeper the foundation has to be. Because that foundation has to hold up the height of that, whatever that structure is going to be. And the foundation has to be poured, the cement. You need certain quality cement, and maybe has been reinforced with maybe metal to be able to hold that structure. That's what it's all about. And if it's not going to hold. It's not going to be secure enough. Ultimately, it's going to collapse. The Jewish people, if you're going into Canaan, you can't go in, as they say, half-baked. If there's any question that you people doubt what God is and what he's not, it's unacceptable. You cannot be the founding families of the Jews entering into Israel. With that kind of impurity, lack of faith, lack of trust, You don't make the grade. You can't go in. The new generation has to go in. Because here you saw Sinai, you experienced Sinai, you prophesied the wake state at Sinai, you witnessed all the miracles, and after everything's said and done, you see it so wrongly, it's not going to happen. You will not be the foundation of the Jewish people in Israel, in the promised land. Therefore, they will have to perish. Now, Rashi himself says that when they asked for spies initially, really at that moment they didn't deserve to go in. Rashi, read the words of the Midrash. When they asked for spies, God says to Moshe, Moshe consults with God, and God says to Moshe, Ani Amarti Elohem Shitov, I already told them what it's all about. It's a good land. Shenemar, Ale Eschem Mi'oni Mitzrayim. Chayeyem Shani Noslem Mokum Litos. I already told what it is. I took them out of the impoverished state of Egypt, put them on a pedestal. I swear I will give them a way that they will fail as a result of the spies. So the question is, if God set it up that they should fail, knowing exactly how they're going to process it, why bring about Chil Hashem? At this point, he says, you people are perishing. You don't deserve to go in because of this mistrust. So let's end it right here. Why did they have to go through the whole scenario? Spies coming back, a public desecration of God's name. God says, because you asked the question and you did not trust me, I will create a scenario that you will make a mistake and you will fail with the sin of the Meraglim. And that will reveal who you people really are. Why? Very often, you have a child and the child doesn't deserve a privilege. But the child is too immature, not understanding why the privilege is being withdrawn from him. So you let the child continue misbehaving and does something so drastic, even the child understands why he doesn't deserve it. But unless the child himself understands he doesn't deserve it, and he himself is the cause of forfeiting that right, that privilege, the child would always have a claim against the parent. You denied me. So the parent allows the child even to go to a point where he causes more damage, because ultimately it's in the best interest of the child to understand why he's not deserving and why he forfeited. God says, if I tell the Jews, it's an inappropriate question. It's an inappropriate request. What was so terrible? Don't we have a right to ask to scatter out the land? But God knows what's in their hearts. It's due to the distrust they have in him. They themselves didn't even realize to what level they were. God says, I'll let it play out. When it plays out, I'll put them in the setting where it's going to look really ugly. And it will reflect terribly on them, despite the fact is that it's going to be a public desecration of my name. Because otherwise they will never understand why they're not deserving. What are they going to say? The reason why God's not taking them in is because he's not able to take them in. Oh, they'll come up with some other reason. God is not equitable. God is very equitable. Because after they failed, they understood why they deserved not to go in. And very often that's life. We all have complaints. I'm such a good Jew. Why is God mistreating you? Me or the community? Why? Okay, let's make an evaluation. How much do you study? How often do you speak about your fellow? Let's look between man and fellow and God. I mean, are you do you smell like a rose? Or are you something other than that? Well, I think I'm a pretty good person. It's like a person says, I'm an epitome of health, goes to the doctor. Doctor says, you're going right away to the ICU. And plus, we're going to be in quarantine because, you're contagious. We can't, even the doctors have to go with protective garb. But I'm so healthy. You can believe what you are, but that's not reality. So God has to allow life to unfold and evolve that we should understand what the reality is. And that's what happened here with the spies. He had to let them go through all the motions and eventually come back and understand why they're not deserving. But now God says it's too late. Because since factually it became a public desecration of my name, which is unforgivable, tshuva is not enough, suffering is not enough. You're only fully atoned and reinstated when you die. So therefore, this whole generation has to perish, and only then could the new generation go into the land for that reason. The ramifications and the consequences of the story of the Meraglim is so unfathomable. That night that the spies came back, the Jews were bemoaning their fate that God took them to destroy them. So the Chazal, the Midrash says, it's referred to as Bechia Shel Chinam. It's an unwarranted crying. What you cried now, it's unwarranted. You know? I give you a gift, a very valuable gift, and you cry. How do you cry? If you'd appreciate what you have, you wouldn't be crying. Over here, why you put yourself in a predicament? Over here, it's unwarranted. And because it's an unwarranted crying, I will give you what to cry in the future. What was the night when they came back? The night was the night of Tisha B'Av. That was the night the spies came back with these ominous reports, and the Jews believed the 10 over the 2. And that night they cried. They cried over the fate that God is out to destroy them. God says, to cry over what you cried over, which is unbased, founded on almost disgraceful. Here I want to put a diamond-studded crown on your head, and you're crying, believing it's something other than that, I'll give you what to cry about in the future. The destruction of the first 2 temples. And 5 tragedies took place on Tisha B'Av. There you'll have what to cry about. So I ask the question. I mean, there we deserve to be destroyed. It says the first temple, they violated 3 cardinal sins. The second, Beis Hamikdash, was unwarranted hate. I mean, what's the measure for measure? Since this is unfounded, I will give you what, there you'll have what to cry about. What do you mean I'll give you what to cry about? Meaning, you should have cried now, I'll give you what to cry about. What exactly is the measure for measure? Now, why did the Jews see it so wrongly? Why was there such a strong claim against them? If a person that is endowed with clarity, one of a kind of clarity, they're known as the Dor Deo. They are the generation of the ultimate people, the greatest level of understanding of reality of existence. They stood at Sinai, God communicated with them. With such a level of clarity, how do you see it so wrong? You know what you have to do? You have to put your head in the sand, and you got to bury yourself not to see it right. You know something? If I give you such a gift of clarity and you abuse it, in the future, I'm pulling it from you. I'm withdrawing it. And because of that lack of clarity, you're going to make serious mistakes in the future. And because of those mistakes, you're going to have what to cry about. The Jews themselves believed whatever they believed, but it was a lack because they didn't have this clarity. So when you have clarity, this is the way you behave, you don't deserve that level of clarity. Because look what you did with clarity, therefore I withdraw the clarity. First temple, second temple, Haruge Beitar, the martyrs of Beitar, whatever it was, the destruction of Yerushalayim. Afterwards, the Romans, they reduced it to rubble, whatever it was. Everything was as a result of, because when we had the gift and we abused the gift, God withdraws it, and then we grope like a blind man in midday, not knowing in what direction we're going. So therefore, until the coming Mashiach, Tisha B'Av is the day to commemorate the tragedy of the Meraglim. That's where it all began, of the spies. But as we say in the Nachem on Tisha B'Av, today it was destroyed by fire in the Beis Hamikdash, but the temple, the Beis Hamikdash, will be rebuilt by fire. And today it's a day of mourning, but ultimately Tisha B'Av will be a day of rejoicing, and it'll be a holiday, because that's when we're going to have the new Beis Hamikdash restored, and everything will be at the ultimate level, the way it should have been initially. To be continued. Everybody be well. Okay. Cold.
Rabbi, thank you.
Everybody take care.
Thanks, Rabbi.